All right, grade 8s. We're moving on to chapter 7 today. Short chapter, only 4 sections. The first 2 dealing with different types of graphs, and then the last 2 sections we get into some probability. 7.1 labeled choosing an appropriate graph. We will be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of some of the main graphs that you've come across already, as well as maybe a new one. So bar graphs, line graphs, circle graphs, and we'll also look at pictographs, which is not really a common one used. So we'll show kind of what are some of the strengths of certain graphs or some of the weaknesses, and so we'll get into it right away here. So here's a situation. You can also follow along in your book, especially if you have a bit of trouble reading it. Skateboard sales of in a few different graphs. It's actually showing the exact same information. So it's showing how many sales of the skateboards for each month of the year. And we can see pretty quickly that some of these are showing percentages, like the circle graph showing percentages. These ones actually show pretty close to an actual amount. If you read the labels on the sides, this is money or the sales for skateboards. Okay. So we can answer some of these questions, and that'll kind of lead us into what are some of the strengths and what are some of the weaknesses. Okay, so what do you know from each graph? Well, what we know from each graph, we can tell pretty quickly what is the best month for sales, what's the worst month for sales, just by looking at either the percentages or how big the graph is or how high the line is. Okay, so we can actually start answering some of these questions. Which graph is the most helpful in answering each below? So which 2 months have the greatest skateboard sales? Well, I don't have to work very hard looking at the line graph to see which 2 months are the best, right? June and July. Here, I don't have to work too hard either. I just have to look which bar is the highest, June and July. Here I have to do maybe a little bit more work. I just have to see which section's the biggest. I'll just double check by looking at the percentages that go with 14 and 13%. So actually all of them work. My preference would be bar graph, because you just simply look, what's the highest bar? Okay, that would be probably the best. What's the range in skateboard sales? Range just meaning the highest to the lowest. And again, I think I would go to either the line graph or the bar graph and see which one's kind of the lowest. If I look closely, it looks like probably February gets a little bit lower, kind of at that 200 range. So basically sales would go anywhere from 200 on the low end to just over 1,000 somewhere, maybe 1,050, something like that, somewhere close there. So there's the range. These 2 graphs will be able to tell me actually numbers, but these just give me the percentages. So the percent of the total sales. You can see already there's the downfall in a circle graph. Okay, what percent of total skateboard sales occurred in May? Well, this one, if I would have to do that from the line graph, it would be pretty much impossible. From the bar graph, if I wanted to find the percent, I would have to add up all these numbers and then figure out the total, and then take just May and then divide top by bottom. We divide how many in May divided by the total. Then I could get the percentage, but it would be a lot of work. This circle graph already has the percentage, so I literally just have to find where May is and see it's 10%. Okay, so we can see some graphs are better for answering certain questions depending what you're looking at. Okay, couple other ones. So line graphs, and we'll look at double bar graphs as well. Just looking at some of the advantages of using a line graph. You can read in your book some of the things, but the big thing is that it's best to use over time. So a bar graph and line graph can be similar, but sometimes it doesn't really make sense to join the points. Here's a situation where we're talking about the value of a car. So we're talking about that same car's value and how that's changing over time. It's depreciating over time. And so it actually makes sense year by year to actually track that. It wouldn't really you could do it with a bar graph, but it wouldn't really make as much sense to have separate bars. It makes more sense. So that's where you're going to see the line graphs typically used, is showing changes over time. Okay, bar graphs can be nice because we can also do double bar graphs. We can actually compare 2 different things. So here's the number of students. Looks like how many are with having a part-time job between 14 and 18. So did not work versus worked. Okay, so we've got 14-year-olds. This many worked, this many didn't. This many worked, this many didn't when they're 15, 16, and then 17 and 18. You can see kind of the trend there, that as you get older, more and more kids typically are working. So advantages of a double bar graph: easy to read, easy to draw, can be used to directly compare two sets. So I can see very quickly, I can see by the size of the bar, and I can compare easily. It can only be used to show discrete data, so there has to be kind of a number, and then it may be difficult to read accurately depending on the scale. So the bigger the numbers, right, these are fairly small, 2, 4, right, I can see that this actually represents one person. But if this was 400 and 800, it'd be difficult to actually show what's 122 on a scale that uses 400. Well, it's hard to be exact. So that's maybe one of the downfalls of a bar graph. Okay, so we'll get into the example here. Grade 8 students are surveyed about how many times they use the vending machine: 0, 1 to 3, 4 to 9, or 10 or more times. Okay, Fred used the bar graph, Scully used the pictograph, and Marie displayed it on a circle graph. So the pictograph's on the next page. But what are the strengths and limitations? Which graph is appropriate? So we'll just talk about the strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, with circle graphs, if you're interested in percents, great. Circle graphs are awesome. However, they're very difficult to draw. If you wanted to actually do this properly, you would have done it in grade 7. You actually have to get your protractor out, you got to measure the angles, you got to calculate what the angles need to be based on the percentage. It's a lot of work. So if we can avoid doing a circle graph, probably want to avoid it if possible. It is nice if you actually calculate it and you get the percentage, but it's a lot of work to actually find that percentage as well. Okay. Bar graphs, nice and neat. You can do it easily. You don't even need grid paper all the time. You can do a decent readable bar graph. But again, one of the limitations would be if you have a really, really big scale, it's hard to be exact. But I think for most things, bar graphs are pretty useful. Pictograph, this is by far the least useful. You're going to see this, it's the least common thing. Basically, the advantage would be, oh, it's kind of neat. And so they actually draw pictures of a vending machine. Well, if you got all sorts of time and you want to do that, great. But of course, it's difficult because you got to make sure you're drawing them all the same size. Otherwise, it can start to be misleading. And also, if your scale is too big, this one has each vending machine represents 2. But what if it was 10? What if each represented 10? Well, how do you show 9 students? How do you draw like 1/10 of a vending machine or 9/10 of a vending machine? That's the clear downfall. So it's pretty much like a bar graph, pictograph, but it's just takes way more time. So if you're creative and you really got time on your hands and you want to make it look cool, great, use a pictograph. Practically not going to be used very often. Okay, so this is in your book. I'm not going to read through them all. It's pretty much summarizing some of these things: circle graphs, strengths, limitations; bar graphs, strengths, limitations. You can read through those in your book, as well as the pictograph one. Okay. Example 2, I'm just going to mostly walk through it again. So here's another survey of grade 8 students, and here's the type of video games they like playing, so action, role play. For me, if I'm given this information, I think a bar graph is probably the best. Action, role playing, arcade, strategy, simulation, and other. Okay. Picking a scale just to put on the other side goes up to 15. So if I just did 5, 10, and 15, then I can roughly estimate how big these bars need to be. So for action, I would have up to 15. Role playing is 10. Arcade is 4, so just a little less. Strategy is 7, somewhere there. 11 for simulation, and then other is 3. Okay, so there's my graph. What are the advantages and disadvantages? We already talked about that. In the book, they actually picked, for whatever reason, a circle graph, so they might have been interested in the percents. But notice they'll have to actually calculate what the percent, and if you're going to do that, you need to grab your protractor and actually measure the angle that goes with that. So that'd be a huge disadvantage for me to doing. Okay, So you've got a few questions you can practice on page 387. Have fun.